The world used to feel different. In medieval Europe, there was one truth. It was God's truth. The Catholic Church was its guardian. This wasn't just a belief people had on Sundays. It was the air they breathed. It was the foundation of law, society, and reality itself. The king ruled by God's grace. The harvest failed because of God's will. Your soul's destination after death was the most important fact of your existence. Everything was tied to the church. To challenge the church was to challenge everything. It was like challenging the existence of the sun. But people did challenge it. They had different ideas about God, about Jesus, about the soul. The church called these ideas heresy. A heretic wasn't just someone with a different opinion. They were seen as a sickness. Heresy was a spiritual plague that could infect a whole town, a whole kingdom, and drag everyone to hell. It was treason against God, and treason was the worst possible crime. At first, the church tried to deal with heresy through preaching. Bishops and priests would argue with heretics. They would try to persuade them to come back to the true faith. Sometimes this worked, but in some places, heresy was not just a few people whispering in a corner. It was an entire alternative way of life. The most famous of these groups were the Cathars. They flourished in southern France in the 12th and 13th centuries. They were also called Albigensians, after the town of Albi. The Cathars believed in two gods. There was a good God, the creator of the spiritual world. And there was an evil God, the creator of the physical world. Everything you could see and touch, including your own body, was a prison created by this evil God. The soul was a spark of the good God, trapped inside this prison of flesh. This belief had huge consequences. If the physical world was evil, then the Catholic Church, with its grand cathedrals, its wealthy bishops, and its sacraments involving physical things like water and bread and wine, was part of the evil world. The Cathars saw the church as a corrupt fraud. They had their own leaders, their own rituals, their own simple way of life. They were a parallel church, and they were popular. Many nobles in southern France protected them. The local people admired their piety. For the Pope in Rome, this was an existential threat. This wasn't just a theological disagreement, this was a rebellion. After decades of failed preaching, Pope Innocent III decided on a more direct approach. In 1209, he called a crusade, not against Muslims in the Holy Land, but against Christians in the heart of Europe. The Albigensian Crusade was a brutal, bloody war that lasted for 20 years. Armies marched through southern France, burning towns and slaughtering people. The infamous quote, "Kill them all, God will know his own," comes from this crusade. The crusade killed a lot of people. It broke the power of the local lords who protected the Cathars. But it didn't kill the idea. You can't kill a belief with a sword. Heresy went underground. Cathar preachers moved in secret from village to village. The belief survived, hidden away in the minds of the people. The church needed a new tool. It needed something more precise than an army. It needed a way to hunt down ideas, not just bodies. It needed a method to investigate, to interrogate, and to root out the sickness of heresy one person at a time. This need gave birth to the Inquisition. It wasn't born from a single evil mind. It grew out of fear. It was a tool created to protect what they saw as the one and only truth, in a world where spiritual damnation was more real and more terrifying than any earthly death. The Inquisition didn't just appear overnight. It was built piece by piece like a machine. It was a bureaucratic solution to a spiritual problem. The old way of dealing with heresy was for the local bishop to handle it. But bishops were often busy. They had lands to manage and political games to play. Many were local men tied to local families. They might be reluctant to accuse a powerful neighbor of heresy. The system was slow and ineffective. Heresy was spreading faster than the bishops could stamp it out. Pope Gregory IX changed that in the 1230s. He decided to centralize the process. He took the main responsibility for fighting heresy away from the bishops and gave it to a new kind of agent. These were men who answered directly to him. They were the Inquisitors. He chose them from the new mendicant orders of monks, the Dominicans and the Franciscans. This was a clever choice. The Dominicans, in particular, were perfect for the job. They were called the Hounds of the Lord. They were highly educated theologians. They were trained to debate and to understand the finest points of doctrine. They could spot heresy where a normal priest might miss it. They were also outsiders. They weren't tied to local politics. Their loyalty was to the Pope, not to the local duke. They could travel anywhere they were needed, live simply, and focus entirely on their mission, the purification of the faith. So, how did the machine work? An inquisitor would arrive in a town or village where heresy was suspected. He wasn't just a random accuser, he was an investigator and a judge, all rolled into one. His arrival was a major event. He would present his credentials from the Pope to the local authorities, both church and secular. The local lord or king was expected to cooperate. It was their duty to God. The first step was the Edict of Grace. The Inquisitor would preach a sermon in the main church. He would explain the evils of heresy and then announce a period of grace, usually lasting from 15 to 30 days. During this time, anyone who was a heretic could come forward and confess freely. If they did, they would be given a light penance, like a pilgrimage, or wearing a cross on their clothing. They would be reconciled with the church and their soul would be saved. This was a powerful psychological weapon. It encouraged people to confess, but it did something else too. It encouraged them to denounce others. A part of the confession process was naming every other heretic you knew. Who did you pray with? Who taught you these beliefs? Who else was at the secret meetings? If you held back names, your own confession was considered incomplete and insincere. The Edict of Grace turned communities against themselves. It sowed suspicion and fear. A husband might inform on his wife. A child might inform on their parents. No one knew who had confessed and what names they had given. After the period of grace ended, the real Inquisition began. The Inquisitor would open his court. Now, people were summoned based on the denunciations he had collected. A person would be arrested and brought before the Inquisitor, often without being told what they were accused of or who had accused them. The proceedings were secret. The accused had no right to a lawyer in the way we understand it. Any lawyer who tried to mount a vigorous defense of an accused heretic might himself be suspected of being a heretic sympathizer. The accused was at a massive disadvantage. They faced a skilled legal and theological expert. The goal of the entire process was not to determine guilt or innocence. Guilt was already assumed. The goal was to get a confession. The Inquisitor's job was to save the person's soul, and that could only happen if they admitted their sin and repented. The machine was designed for one outcome. It was a conveyor belt that moved the accused from accusation to confession. And if they refused to confess, the machine had other, darker tools to persuade them. The trial began, and the suspect was now fully in the grip of a system from which very few would escape unchanged. The interrogation chamber was not a place of wild, chaotic violence. It was a place of cold, calculated procedure. Everything that happened there was written down by a clerk. The questions, the answers, the denials, the screams. It was all documented. This is what makes it so chilling. This was not a mob, this was a bureaucracy at work. Imagine you are the accused, you are alone, you have been held in a cell for weeks, maybe months. The food is poor. You have not spoken to anyone. You are brought into a room. The Inquisitor sits at a table with his clerk. He is not a monster foaming at the mouth. He is a calm, educated man. He believes he is doing God's work. He believes he is trying to save your soul from eternal fire, and he is willing to use any means necessary to do it. The interrogation is a psychological battle. The Inquisitor has all the power. He knows who accused you. You do not. He might tell you, many people have testified against you. We know everything. Your only hope is to confess. It might be a lie. There might only be one accuser, a personal enemy settling a score. But you don't know that. You are asked questions about your beliefs, your friends, your family. Every answer is a potential trap. If you deny the charge, the Inquisitor's tone becomes sterner. He might put you back in your cell for a few more weeks to think things over. Isolation and despair are powerful tools. They break the will. But what if you continue to deny? What if you are innocent or just stubborn? Then the Inquisitor might decide that your body is hiding the truth that your soul needs to release. The Church had a rule, ecclesia abhorret a sanguine. The Church abhors the shedding of blood. So, Inquisitors were not supposed to use methods that drew blood. This led to a grim creativity in the design of torture. Officially, torture was a last resort. It could only be used once, but Inquisitors got around this by suspending a session and then continuing it days later, claiming it was all part of the same single application. The methods were designed to inflict maximum pain without necessarily causing death. A doctor was often present to advise the torturer on how much the suspect could endure. The goal was not to kill, but to break. One of the most common methods was the strappato, or the pulley. The accused's hands were tied behind their back. The rope was then looped over a pulley on the ceiling. They were hoisted into the air, hanging by their arms from behind. This would quickly dislocate their shoulders. The pain was excruciating. To increase the agony, they could be suddenly dropped, stopping just before they hit the floor. The jolt would tear through their body. Another method was the water torture. The accused was strapped to a board or a ladder with their head lower than their feet. Their mouth was forced open, often with a piece of cloth stuffed inside. Then, water was slowly poured into their mouth and nose. The cloth would become saturated, and the person would feel like they were drowning. They would gag and suffocate. The pressure in their stomach and lungs from a large quantity of water would be immense. And then there was the rack. This is perhaps the most famous instrument. The victim's ankles and wrists were tied to rollers at opposite ends of a wooden frame. The torturer would turn a handle, slowly pulling the ropes. The victim's body would be stretched. Joints would be pulled from their sockets. The sound of ligaments tearing and bones popping would fill the room. Under this agony, most people would confess. They would confess to anything. They would say they were a heretic. They would name their friends and family as heretics. They would agree to whatever the Inquisitor wanted them to say. The clerk would write it all down. After the torture was over, the victim would be taken back to their cell. The next day, they would be brought before the Inquisitor again. The confession they had screamed out in the torture chamber would be read back to them. They would be asked to confirm it, now freely and without coercion. If they refused, the Inquisitor could threaten to send them back to the chamber for a continuation of the previous session. Almost everyone signed. The machine had its confession. The path to judgment was now clear. A confession did not mean freedom. It simply moved the process to its next stage, sentencing. The Inquisition wasn't just about punishment. It was about public order and demonstrating the power of the church. The sentences were meant to be lessons for the entire community. The final act was a grand public spectacle, a piece of religious theater known as the Sermo Generales, or, more famously from the later Spanish Inquisition, the auto da fe, which means act of faith. This was not a secret event. It was a massive ceremony held in the town square. Everyone was expected to attend. It was a holy day. A long procession would wind through the streets. At the front were church officials, followed by local nobles and civil authorities. And then came the condemned. Their appearance was part of the spectacle. Each one wore a special garment, a yellow tunic called a San Benito. What was painted on the San Benito told the public about their crime and their fate. Most would have 2 yellow crosses on their tunic. These were the people who had confessed and repented. Their lives would be spared. Their sentences would be things like a long pilgrimage to a distant shrine, a fine, the confiscation of all their property, or imprisonment. And prison was a serious punishment. There were 2 kinds. Murus largus was a shared cell. Murus strictus was solitary confinement in chains, a slow death sentence for many. These reconciled heretics were now marked for life. They had to wear the yellow crosses on all their outer clothing, everywhere they went, for the rest of their days. They were living symbols of the Church's mercy and a constant warning to others. But there were other figures in the procession. These were the ones who would not be spared. They were the relapsed heretics, those who had been forgiven once, but had returned to their old beliefs. And they were the obstinate heretics, those who refused to confess, even under torture, or who refused to repent. Their San Benitos were different. They were painted with flames, and sometimes with demons pushing souls into hell. If the flames pointed upwards, it meant the person was to be burned alive. If the flames pointed downwards, it meant the person had repented at the very last minute. They would be granted a small mercy. They would be strangled to death before the fire was lit. The procession ended at the square. A stage had been built. The sentences were read out loud, one by one, for all to hear. It took hours. The reconciled heretics were formally welcomed back into the fold of the church. Then came the final act for the condemned. The church maintained its principle of not shedding blood. So the Inquisitor would not carry out the execution himself. He would formally relax the condemned to the secular arm. This was a legal fiction. The Inquisitor would hand the prisoner over to the local lord or town guards. He might say a prayer, asking them to be merciful and to not kill the prisoner. But everyone knew what this meant. It was a command. The secular authorities were required by law to execute the heretic, usually within 5 days. The execution site was typically outside the city walls. A stake had been prepared. The condemned was tied to it. Piles of wood were stacked around their feet. The crowd watched. For them, this was a deeply religious moment. They were witnessing justice being done. They were seeing the community being purified of a terrible infection. The fire was lit. Burning at the stake was a symbolic death. Fire was seen as a purifying element. It cleansed the world of the heretic's physical presence. It also ensured there was no body left to be venerated as a martyr by their followers. For the person at the stake, it was one of the most agonizing deaths imaginable. It was slow. The flames would lick at their legs, burning away their skin, boiling the fat, cooking the muscle. The smoke would choke them. They would be alive for many minutes, screaming, until the flames finally reached their vital organs or the carbon monoxide poisoned them. The act of faith was complete. A soul was sent to its final judgment, and a terrifying message had been sent to all who watched. The medieval Inquisition achieved its primary goals. It was brutally effective. In southern France, Catholicism was systematically destroyed. By the mid-14th century, it was virtually extinct. Other heretical movements across Europe, like the Waldensians, were driven deep underground or wiped out. The machine had worked. It had restored religious unity through fear and force. It had created a world where challenging the church was not just wrong, it was unthinkable for most people. But the machine, once built, did not disappear. The model of a centralized, powerful legal body designed to investigate and prosecute thought crimes was a powerful one. Its legacy is most famously seen in the Spanish Inquisition, which began in the late 15th century. While the Spanish Inquisition is often lumped together with the medieval one, it was a different beast. It was controlled by the Spanish monarchy, not primarily the Pope, and it focused its terror on conversos Jews and Muslims, who had converted to Christianity, but were suspected of practicing their old faith in secret. But it used the same tools: secret testimony, the assumption of guilt, psychological pressure, and, when necessary, torture and the auto da fe. It was the Spanish Inquisition and the political propaganda used against Spain by its Protestant enemies like England and the Netherlands that created the Black Legend. This was the idea of the Inquisition that we are most familiar with today, a monolithic, all-powerful, sadistic organization that tortured and burned millions in a frenzy of religious fanaticism. This image, printed in pamphlets and horror stories, became the dominant popular view. The historical reality is more complex. The medieval Inquisition was not a single, unified organization. It was a series of inquisitorial courts that operated with a great deal of local variation. Some inquisitors were zealous and cruel, others were more lenient, and the numbers, while horrifying, were not in the millions. Historians estimate that in the first century of its operation, the tribunals in southern France were responsible for several thousand executions. That is a terrible number, but it is not the Holocaust of popular imagination. Far more people were sentenced to wear crosses, go on pilgrimages, or serve time in prison. But to focus only on the numbers is to miss the point. The true power of the Inquisition was not the body count. It was the fear. It was the knowledge that anyone at any time could be denounced. It was the understanding that your neighbor, your friend, even your own child could be an informant. It created a climate of suspicion that stifled dissent and intellectual curiosity. It taught people that some ideas were too dangerous to even think about. The most lasting legacy of the Inquisition wasn't the ashes of the burned, but the silence of those who were too afraid to speak. It stands as a grim monument to the dangers of absolute certainty. It is a story about what happens when one institution believes it has a monopoly on truth, and when it gains the power to enforce that truth on everyone. It shows how the desire to save souls can be used to justify the destruction of bodies. The interrogation chamber, the San Benito, the stake, these are not just relics of a dark and distant past. They are warnings. They show us the terrible, methodical cruelty that humans are capable of, especially when they are convinced they are doing it for your own good. The shadow it left is long, and it reminds us that the line between faith and fanaticism can be terrifyingly thin.